Right. Okay. Sorry about this. Let me just undo that and start again. There we go. Right, good afternoon, everyone, and you're all very welcome to this, our ninth and final Dante dialogue of this Anno Dantesco. Today's dialogue is a little bit different from all of the others, as we wanted it to be a celebration of Dante's presence in Ireland and in Irish culture, and from a literary perspective, but also encompassing, I think, music and the visual arts. So this is, in a sense, what we call in Irish an oireachtas, that is a kind of gathering of people together. So later on, there will be readings of Dante in Italian, in English, in Irish, and even in Galician. And I'll also be talking with the musician and composer Elliot Murphy about his extraordinary piece for cello, Inferno, which premiered back at the end of September in Dublin Castle, with the President of Ireland in attendance. And before then again, I'll be discussing the topic of Irishing Dante with my two friends, Emily Cárthaigh and Kenneth Clarke. But before we get into all of that, as this is the very final event of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland for this Dante septicentennial year, I wanted just to recap on some of the activities of the Centre and of its members. As you all know by now, the CDSI was formally established last year, just in time for the 700th anniversary. And as we said it before, but it's worth repeating, the CDSI supports a transdisciplinary culture of collaborative research across the various strands of Dante studies. And it's located here at University College Cork, and it seeks to respond to a genuine need within the Irish academic, creative and intellectual communities to have an Irish-based centre which not only fosters world-class research on the figure of Dante and the myriad of related fields related to him, but which engages with the wider public in exploring how Dante's encyclopedic divine comedy creates a rich dialogue with today on notions such as citizenship, even exile, migration, moral responsibility, conflict resolution, and the polysemous nature of language and much else besides. Now, UCC has a long track record with regard to Dante, and this also includes its annual Dante Public Lecture Series, which began running in 2011. And obviously with the outbreak of COVID, just before the Dante centenary, we had to come up with new ways to communicate with a wider public. Now, as with others, we embraced this new online ethos and thus ensured that we could communicate effectively with a new international audience as well. And the collegiality and support of Alison Cornish, Sig Baranski, Lino Pertile, and Sam Gilson was very much instrumental in ensuring that last January's series was a great success. But research has been our main focus, and members of the Centre had quite substantial publications to their name. In fact, the volume you see there to your right was just published last year by OUP, written by the Centre co-director David Bowe. All of the members of the Centre were involved in quite significant publications this year in major international journals such as L'Alighieri and Dante Studies, and also this wonderful edited volume of Rachel Owen's Dante Illustrations. But I want to signal out one publication, and that is Federica Coluzzi's Dante Beyond Influence, Rethinking Reception in Victorian Literary Culture, published by Manchester University Press. Federica received her physical copy of the book just this week, so our congratulations go to her. So well done, Federica. And alongside also these individual projects, Centre members also collaborate on a number of projects, such as this one, Mediating Dante, which I think began as a conversation and soon blossomed into something quite substantial and will culminate in a special issue of Italian Studies, which will be published later on next year. So who are these people? Who are the members of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland? And there you can see them. We have Dr. Valentina Mele, who's an IRC postdoctoral fellow here at UCC. Dario Galassini, who's IRC postgraduate scholar here at UCC. Dr. Leyla Livraghi, IRC postdoctoral fellow at UCC. Dr. David Bowe, co-director of the Centre and formerly IRC postdoctoral fellow at UCC, and Dr. Federico Coluzzi, formerly IRC postdoctoral fellow and now at the University of Warwick. And over there on the right is the newest member of our team, Elsina Caponetti, who recently won the prestigious Edvaldo Sacconi PhD scholarship here at UCC. So it's quite a group. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all 6 of them for their Trojan work in establishing the centre. Their enthusiasm, their hard work and dedication throughout the year has been exemplary. Especially this year, with the anniversary and indeed with the pandemic, they found new and exciting ways to reach out and interrogate Dante from ever new perspectives, especially under the umbrella of what we call the Dante dialogues, of which this evening is one. We've had Dante in Dialogue to launch David's book, as well as the wonderful Approaching Dante with our friend and collaborator Heather Webb, with guests Simone Marchesi and George Corbett. Then there was Collecting Dante Between Archives and Libraries with Julianne Simpson, Corinna Salvadori Lonergan and Christian Dupont, mediated by Federica. And also Illustrating Dante, Manuscripts Medieval and Modern with Melissa Conway and George Corcoran, mediated by David. More recently, we had the Translating Dante, mediated by Valentina, which brought together poets and translators, Jacob Blakesley, Cormac O'Quillinon, Mary Jo Bang, Bernard O'Donoghue, and Philip Terry. And then also we had Appropriating Dante, female voices, rereading and rethinking the language of men with Daniela Caselli, Cristina Landa, and Clara Santarelli. And that was wonderfully mediated by Dario. More recently still, the focus has shifted to Dante's life, with 2 dialogues. The first, Understanding Dante's Life with Elisa Brilli and Giuliano Milani, mediated by Matteo Ottaviani. And last week we had Uncovering Dante's biography with Alberto Casadei and Alessandro Barbero, with Leyla mediating. I should also mention that as part of our outreach activities, we also curated and hosted the online version of the Irish artist Liam O'Brien's 100 lithographs, inspired by the 100 cantos of Dante's Divine Comedy. Our collaboration with Liam stretches back a number of years, but I just want to make it clear that this collection is a unique artistic engagement with Dante and his work. And I would urge anybody not yet familiar with his work to go to our website to see this wonderful exhibition, where you can see the suite in its entirety. We were going to close the online exhibition at the end of this year, but we've decided to keep it running indefinitely. And my special thanks go to Dario Galassini for his gargantuan work on that particular project. These then are just some of the activities we've been involved in, and that does not include the many lectures, seminars, conference papers that centre members have been involved in over the course of the year. And here I just want to signal the Alma Dante conference in Ravenna, where some of us got together for the first time, essentially as a group, and also the grand finale of the Lecture Dantes Andrea Politano in Scotland. We had a very significant centre presence there as well. And last month there was also, the centre was very present at the joint Cambridge and Oxford centenary celebrations. It's been a long year, it's been well worth it, and our sincerest thanks go to David, Federica, Valentina, Leyla, Dario, and Elsina, and all the friends and colleagues who have contributed and helped throughout the year. So thank you all. So now to today, and as I said, today is less of a dialogue and more of a celebration. And I'm delighted to welcome our 2 guests, Dr. Kenneth Clarke and Dr. Emily Corey. Kenneth is senior lecturer in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York. His interests are in late medieval Italian literature, in book production and circulation. And he's also interested in all aspects of Dante's work, and in particular, the flourishing of commentary material on the Commedia, appearing in the century or so after the author's death. He's also the author of the wonderful Chaucer and Italian Textuality from OUP. Emma Nichorhig is a lecturer in the Department of Early and Medieval Irish here at University College Cork. She has worked on the Locus project since 2003 and on the De Finibus project since 2009. Her research interests include onomastics, medieval Irish literature, and bardic poetry. And Emma, I suppose more than anyone else, is also one of the most indulgent people I know, in that she has to listen to me practically every day bang on about Dante on a daily basis. So I welcome you both. So maybe, Emma, if I could start with you, you're very welcome. And
Thank you.
You've heard me talking about Dante a lot, but talk to me a little bit about before Dante, because there exists in Ireland a discrete body of literature which, considers the afterlife, the underworld, punishment, beatitude, these types of things. And there's one in particular, if you wouldn't mind talking about a little, which has a very strong core connection, and I'm obviously talking about the Visio Tenuctali. Could you explain a little bit about this? Because these are, and have been framed in other contexts as possible precursors to Dante. And certainly in the case of something like the Visio Tenuctali, which did have vernacular translation in Florence in the 14th century, but also because it was written in Latin, had a very wide circulation in Europe. Could you talk to me a little bit about this?
Well, I suppose in a way, looking at Visio Tenuctali first is a little bit like taking things in medias res, because in some way, first of all, it's the longest of the Irish visions, and it's quite late. It's 12th century, it's very late in the Irish vision tradition. And also, unlike other medieval Irish visions, it is concerned with the salvation of the individual soul, much as, I suppose, the figure of Dante is concerned as well. And the conversations between Tenuchtal and his psychopomp are much more similar to the conversations between Dante and Virgil than the conversations that happen between the psychopomps we find in the earlier Irish visions. And so it's an extraordinary text in its own right. It is, as I said, it's very late. It's also very long, and the cataloguing of things, particularly the torments, is very detailed, much more detailed than in the other visions. And it also, unlike the other visions, it lays an emphasis and spends a lot of time talking about, a little bit like the Dantean experience, purgatory and heaven as well, and the divine. And as you know yourself from the 15th century illustrations done by Simon Marmion, the soul starts off black and it gets paler and paler and paler and paler as he makes his way. But also, what is also unusual about the vision of Tenuchtal in the Irish context is that Tenuchtal, he's a knight, he's a secular character, he's not a cleric, he's not a saint, and he has been very bad in his life. He's a murderer. He has committed all kinds of crimes and sins. And often in earlier visions, you will find the character who is drawn up into the visionary experience is a righteous cleric who's just being shown all these things. So there's an awful lot that is different about Tenuchtal from the other visions, from the earlier Irish visions. So Tenuchtal itself, I suppose the vision of Tenuchtal itself represents a kind of innovation that has taken place in the 12th century based on what came before. And then much later, well, not that much later, I suppose, we find Dante going much, much, much further again. So there's an awful lot about Tenuchtal that we find in Dante. But to go before Tenuchtal and to perhaps say a few words about where the monk Marcus in Regensburg in Bavaria got his inspiration. He would have had his inspiration from existing visions. And these go, as you know, they go back to the vision of St. Paul. They go back to, I suppose, the earliest evidence we have for St. Paul's vision is his reference in a letter to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 12, where he says, I know a man in Christ who was caught up to the third heaven. And he speaks then of the untellable, these mysteries, the unsayable, the insägliche, as Rilke has it. And this particular reference gave rise to the two Greek texts, the Anabaticon Paulo and the Apocalypsis Paulo. And the Anabaticon was a Gnostic text and was lost, but the Apocalypsis survived and was copied in Greek, and eventually Latin translations were made of it. And many of these translations, or one of these translations in particular, gave rise to a whole series of shorter redactions. And these redactions, some of these redactions made it over to Ireland, and they were in Latin. And what is really interesting about the Latin redactions that made it to Ireland, they gave rise to the other vision texts that come out both in Irish and in Latin in medieval Ireland. But in the Apocalypse of Paul, in the Latin text, in the Latin redactions, Paul speaks very dramatically in the first person. And there's a sense of immediacy and drama by that. And then I saw, and I saw, and I saw. The Irish translations of Paul's vision leave that behind and move to the third person. And other visions then, such as the vision of Adamnan, the vision of Tnuchtal that we've just talked about, but earlier visions such as the vision of Fursa, the vision of Lashrain, all of these are in the third person. And I find it very quite significant that Dante himself has a sense, an ear for the arresting and the dramatic effect of the first person narrative, because he reaches back to that Pauline visio for the viewpoint he will take, but none of the Irish visions do this. And the Irish visions, I suppose you have two main types of prose texts that ultimately derive from this tradition relating to St. Paul. And these are texts all composed by Irish clerics in either Latin or older Middle Irish, particularly Middle Irish. And they belong to the tradition that ultimately, as you know, influenced the Commedia. But I suppose if you take them, there are two main groups. Firstly, there are these apocryphal vision texts that I've just mentioned, like the vision of Lashrain, the vision of Tnuchtal, the vision of Adamnan, which is very, very, again, has so much in it that we find in the Inferno. And within these visions, within some of them, particularly in the vision of Adamnan, you find embedded the seven heavens apocryphon, this peculiar little apocryphon where a character is brought by a guiding angel through the seven heavens. So you have these apocryphal vision texts, some of which incorporate a journey through the seven heavens. But, and I know you've spoken about this yourself, there's a second group of texts that belong to this tradition. But these are not vision texts. These texts belong to the context of the peregrinatio pro Christi, where clerics went on a journey across the sea, which was known as a peregrinatio potior, a stronger peregrinatio. It's stronger than going on a pilgrimage within your own land. And sometimes this peregrinatio became perennis, they went away forever. And over the sea was stronger, staying away forever was strongest. This was an act of devotion and an act of humility in the face of Christ. And these texts are known as the Imrive, coming from Imriv, to row around. And I know you've spoken about this before yourself. And these Imrive, I suppose the most famous of them is the one that inspired them, and that is the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, which is apocryphal, but it doesn't belong to the eschatological tradition. So like the Navigatio, like the Commedia, comprises a journey on which many lessons are learnt due to various hardships and vicissitudes and so on suffered on the way. And Brendan's boat perhaps is reminiscent of Dante's metaphorical boat, or the little boat, but Brendan only passes by hell and has a brief interchange with Judas Iscariot, where he shows him great mercy. But it's not, it's a journey involving hardship. It's a journey on which lessons are learned, but it's not a vision. The characters are still corporeal, whereas the apocryphal vision texts, such as the vision of Lashrain and the vision of Adamnan and Tnuchtal, the souls are drawn out of their bodies. And Tnuchtal is beautifully described as feasting, as you said, in Cork, which we hope to be doing later. And that was to wake you up. He is feasting. He is feasting in the house of someone he owes horses to. They're terrified of him. He's a horrible man. And the next day he suffers some kind of a seizure. And as you will have heard, some of you will have heard Dagmar O'Rian speaking about this at one of your Dante lectures. She described how he has this seizure. They don't know, they think he might be dead. But when they test him out, they find a small bit of heat along his left side. So they don't bury him as a result, just as well for himself, because he was alive. He was just on this journey where he finds redemption. So I suppose, I don't know if that answers your question, or if you have any, if you wanted to ask anything further along those lines.
Well, the first question one would need to know is what were they serving him for dinner that he had?
I know, that crossed my mind. Tripe, probably.
But I mean, it is a fascinating and kind of rich tradition. And, you know, there have been attempts in the past to kind of link it directly to Dante. But it always seems to be that that specialisms are way heavily too much on one side or the other. And I mean, there's certainly fertile ground for kind of further investigation into these areas. These are wonderful, wonderful texts. I wonder if I could bring in Kenneth there. Are you there, Kenneth?
I am.
Great to see you. I just want to respond a little bit to that, because we know that in 14th century Tuscany, certainly something like the Visio Tenoctali is circulating. There is a vernacular version of it that is now conserved in the Vatican. And also the fact that the text itself was written in Latin, it would have spread around Europe, and indeed it was very popular, because you have new ways of looking at Dante, and I'm thinking here about Lino Pertile, who are looking at Dante as Dante Popolare, Dante who is, yes, does read the great theologians and the wonderful works of kind of high literature, but there's also Dante who is not averse to kind of subsuming into what he is doing a more popular form of literature.
I suppose the thing that's so striking in thinking about the sources of the comedy is how many different ones there are, and how hard it is to be sure of any one particular source being the most important. That it's a prismatic. The sources can only be understood prismatically in that sense. And so that kind of popular tradition, and especially, I suppose, especially that connection between Latin and vernacular is very interesting for these vision texts in particular. I'm thinking about, I mean, the ones that Emma was just mentioning, the kind of the sheer scope and scale of them, the sheer number of them, but also as a very, I mean, in an Irish context, a much easier interaction between the vernacular and Latin. I mean, and in many ways, Irish isn't Middle Irish, and I hesitate to. I mean, I'm treading in ground that I am very, but Irish isn't vernacular in the way that Tuscan is a Romance vernacular in 14th century. Irish is a language of learning and a language of poetry. It has a much higher status, is my sense, in Ireland of the period that you're talking about. Whereas in a generation before Dante, the status of the vernacular is much lower. I mean, it simply doesn't. It simply doesn't compete with Latin, and so that's kind of interesting as well in the way that the kind of this combination of learned and popular in the Irish tradition is has a great force and a great power to it, and it's that kind of combination of Latin and vernacular, and they're not so. There isn't such a clear distinct. I mean, there is a distinction. Of course, there's a distinction between them, but it's not quite hierarchized in the way that it certainly is in 13th century vernacular literature in Italy, or and early 14th century in Tuscany. So it's kind of interesting that Dante should be plugging in to a tradition that's making Latin and vernacular so powerfully in dialogue, and that he's kind of also building on that as well, in a way. I mean, I'm not saying Dante was reading Old Middle Irish. I mean, that would be interesting. But that, and there are, I mean, presumably there are other traditions too in which we could think about this. I mean, Irish isn't the only tradition, but in the context today, that's the one. But it is a very striking aspect to that particular source and those particular kinds of sources that Dante is kind of possibly tapping into, or at least is on his cultural horizon.
I think that's an interesting way to kind of bring this forward and bring it into the kind of English language tradition and bring it forward to the centuries. Because if we've been talking about pre-Dante and this wonderful rich tradition in the Irish tradition of this kind of vision literature, or the peregrinatio, that then we bring it to the kind of how Ireland then did actually receive Dante. I mean, it is significant that the first full translation of the Commedia was written by an Irishman, Henry Boyd, and published in 1802. But it's really, I mean, we have Federica here, obviously, who is our resident expert on Dante in the 19th century, and the British and Irish and indeed Italian reception of Dante. But there is something very different about the way Irish writers respond to Dante. And I want to bring this now into the 20th century. I want to bring this to Joyce. I want to bring this to Beckett. I want to bring this to the poets, to Heaney, to O'Donoghue. There is something about how Irish writers respond to Dante. And it goes back to what you were talking about there, Kenneth, about language. Because, and I'm going to just use the examples of Joyce and of Beckett, first of all, because, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that the two of them studied Italian at university, you know, and that they had, if you like, the access to Dante in the original, and responded to it in a way that other modernist writers couldn't. T.S. Eliot and Pound and all the others, they had a very different type of almost kind of classical Dante, who was the Dante of the commentaries, as opposed to the Dante of the vernacular. And there's something about, and Heaney, I know, writes about this in Reason and Identifications, there's something about the local, the vernacular, that Irish writers plug into, they hold on to with Dante, and Dante gives them license then to do something very transformative with their own literature.
I think that's absolutely right. Hugh Houghton has talked about sort of 20th century reception of Dante having an Irish accent, and it feels right. It feels like there's something very, and it's interesting to step back for a minute and think about, say, Beckett and Joyce. You know, you can name them in one sentence, but but they're from very different traditions, and what Italian means to them and what Dante means to them have very different cultural and social freightings for them, respectively. I mean, Beckett from a middle-class Protestant background, and Joyce from a Catholic background. They're not this. They don't have the same kind of the same weighting at all. And yet, of course, you have Beckett then in Trinity College doing Italian, where that too marks him out as somehow a little bit particular. I mean, I've heard and Corinna Lonergan's work on the chair, the Italian chair in Trinity, as having a whiff of papist attention about it. You know, it always had a slight whiff of something not quite right about it, and that kind of is interesting in that it kind of this sense of positionality, this sense in which these writers are thinking about their own place in traditions, in which they're using Italian as a way of exploring that position, exploring that tradition, and marking themselves out both within a canon and away from a canon as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and what about the later poets then? Because so you have the example of Joyce and you have the example of Beckett. They're doing Italian, and you know, these are these giants of kind of, you know, 20th century modernism. Theirs is kind of, they're almost leapfrogging the kind of the English tradition and kind of embracing something very different through languages. But then you have the kind of the later poets, the later 20th century, the Heaney's, the O'Donoghue's, the Carsons even. I was talking at a conference yesterday in Scotland about Alistair Gray, and I was talking about Kieran Carson. Even there, you have this amazing translation, poetic translation of Dante. And of course, Bernard O'Donoghue, this Cork poet, one of Ireland's finest living poets today, and Matthew Sweeney as well. We're going to hear readings from these poets later on. What's going on there? I mean, that's a different type of Dante, and that's a different, you know, the Italians would use the verb approssimati, moving towards Dante. What is it about Dante as a kind of a poetic figure that is so attractive to these poets?
Well, I don't know. I think that Heaney, very early on, I mean, as far back as the early 90s, and seeing things, he was already considering Aeneid 6. And it seems that from very early on in his own, let's say his own reflective world, he wanted to set himself in the canon with Dante and Virgil and so on. This comes out so much in his poetry from the 90s and thereon. And I get the feeling that the enormity of the Commedia overwhelmed somebody like Heaney, but that it also informed moments of his work beyond his obvious translations of things like, let's say, Aeneid 6, where it's very clear what he's doing, or moments like where later Jason's going to read that part about that passage about Ugolino and the children and so on. But for example, in the spirit level, he talks about Lankesh in Flight Path, which is this extraordinary poem. If you remember it, it's quite a long poem. And he invokes the Inferno to describe Lankesh in this extraordinarily moving way. He uses the ideas that are, let's say, the atmosphere of Inferno in a completely different way in Station Island, where I mentioned a minute ago that medieval Irish visions are a trope, I suppose, of the Latin redactions of the Visio Sancti Pauli, in that Paul sees hell for himself in the Visio, but the medieval Irish visions are a trope of that, in that it's always third person. Dante goes back then to the first person. Heaney does the same in Station Island. He is speaking in a kind of a Dantean voice almost and it's very clearly Patrick's Purgatory. And I know, Kenneth, you want to talk about Patrick's Purgatory in a while. This is the context of Patrick's Purgatory, but this is all bound up in Purgatorio and Inferno. And it would appear, I feel that with Heaney, Dante crops up when you least expect it and when you most expect it. But I really feel he had, as we all know, those of us who have, I suppose, grown up with Heaney alongside us and have followed him and read his books as they came out, I have this very strong sense that of his own poetic vision and his own poetic voice is in the same league as in some ways as the voices of the great epic poets such as Dante himself. And I feel Heaney was a humble man, but I feel that he really wanted to set himself in that canon. That's something I feel when I look at work like this. As we all know, he can do a Wordsworth on it then and write a poem or a sonnet-like poem on a tiny detail, blackberry picking, or, thinking about writing and the pen and tiny, tiny details. But he can take the epic theme as well. And like I said, though, every so often the epic theme pops up out of nowhere. And very often he borrows it from a scene that has moved him in the Inferno, particularly. But anyway, that's just, I suppose, my own response to it. I'm not sure if there's anything in that.
That's wonderful. Kenneth, you want to come in there?
Well, I only to say that I agree. I think I agree entirely. I think that's, that for Heaney, clearly Dante is a way of acknowledging of engaging with a canon that is different to him engaging with an English literary canon, and that it's a kind of way for him to, he has written, for example, about his rendering of Beowulf, as he's talked about it as not poetry he's in love with, and that the poetic isn't, that it's a translation, it's not a poetic rendering, and he contrasts that, or that is contrasted with what eventually happens with Aeneid 6. I mean, that's something else, that's something different again. But I think for the comedy and the way that Dante appears and kind of appears quite a bit actually over that work in the 90s. I mean, 70, obviously 79. With fieldwork you have Ugolino, but and not much. Well, there's a bit of a pause with Dante, and then he kind of reappears with much greater force. But you can see that there's a kind of there's also a kind of journey in a way. Jack Bennett described Chaucer's engagement with Virgil as having been filtered through Dante, that Dante was a way of a reintroduction, or an introduction and reintroduction to the work of Virgil, that for him these were he was engaging with both Dante and Virgil together. And I feel that's the same for Heaney as well, that there's a kind of Virgil and Dante are, I mean, Aeneid 6 and the comedy, visions of the afterlife, the other world, ways of talking about this world by speaking of the other world, the next world, something else, that those are all kind of tied in together, that they're ways of doing things differently. They're ways of finding a voice for what's here and now through what is somewhere else.
And what about a poet like Bernard O'Donoghue then, Kenneth?
Well, I think Bernard O'Donoghue's work is I was just following so reading the 90s. Really, his three of his big collections came out in the 1990s, and really kind of three in the same in that decade. And so there's a temptation, I think, to read Bernard's work a lot in the shadow of Heaney. I think that's true of a lot of poets, actually. I think that they kind of, Heaney casts a shadow in a way. But the way in which, I was very struck by how Dante is present, across all of those early collections. I mean, those three collections from, in The Weakness, he has a poem called The Nth Circle, with this allusion to Francesca. And it's a kind of a curiously sort of, it's a poem of disappointment, and there's a kind of a bitter tone to it. But, but you can trace right, and he has poems in Gunpowder 95, so the middle of that decade, he has two poems in Italian with Italian titles. Yeah. So again, a very direct kind of, and I mean, those titles, Nel mezzo del cammin is the name of one of the poems. I mean, that's about as, I mean, it doesn't get much, but there's another one in that, which is Ebbe ? Ebbe ? Now that's not directly alluding to anything, and in the poem itself there isn't a direct allusion, but it feels very hard not to hear Inferno 10, yes, and Cavalcante in that, and that there's something about pastness, about the preterite, there's something about loss and about grief in that, and it's so that it's, like Emma was saying, how in Heaney you can get Dante appearing when you least expect him, and I feel that in Bernard O'Donoghue's work, that's exactly a moment where he kind of just pops in where you least expect him, and isn't overdone either. It's kind of left. So I think I think it's clear that that Dante, and then of course, I mean, obviously in the final collection of the 90s is Here Nor There, which is a sort of afterlife kind of reference, and that has the great poem Terra Conatus. I mean, that which really is a kind of Virgil and Dante put together. I mean, in a kind of, I mean, it's comedy and Aeneid 6 in the same poem, and so I kind of they're on a parallel track. Those two poets are being worked together, I think, and filed together in a kind of careful and delicate sort of engagement.
Yeah, before I get back to Emma and just talk about the Irish language aspect of things, you mentioned before we came on air, before we started this dialogue, but you mentioned Loch Derg. You were going to say something about that.
Well, I was just struck by thinking about Bernard's engagement with Dante, and just thinking about this afterlife, and Bernard's work, of course, as both a poet and a scholar. Those two things working together for him, and those two things being that he's contributed the chapter on Loch Derg in David Wallace's Europe, a Literary History, which is a medieval, a literary history of medieval Europe, 1348 to 1418, and that is a work that follows itineraries across Europe. So it's a pilgrimage. You know, the structure of the work is generally following pilgrimage itineraries, and one of the points on the itinerary is Loch Derg, and that chapter is written by Bernard O'Donoghue. And so you have this kind of this academic, scholarly engagement with Loch Derg and engagement with, and then you have the poetic engagement in parallel with the Loch Derg kind of shore, and Heaney, of course, be looming large in that too.
Station Island. Thank you, Kenneth. That was wonderful. Emma, if I could just ask you as a way of kind of bringing, not to a close, but to kind of the final part of our conversation here, to ask you about Dante and the Irish language. If you could talk to us a little bit about how Dante gets translated, indeed.
Well, the most famous modern Irish, there's only one full translation that I know of, and it is quite well known, I suppose, in modern Irish, in let's say the field of modern Irish literature and so on, and perhaps beyond. And this is Inferno of that particular translation by Monsignor Padraig de Brún. It's very hard to get hold of it. I don't have a copy. This is a library copy. And the other two books, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, did not actually, they were translated by him. He left typescript at his death, and he was clearly translating it around the time that he died. And that typescript, I was actually quite convinced myself until only the other day that it hadn't been fully published. But our colleague Aidan Doyle over in Modern Irish reminded me that Ciarán Ó Coigile had worked on that and prepared it for publication, and it did come out in 97. And Cormac Ó Cuilleáin has a foreword in that, as well as Amor Vacati also. And Ciarán himself wrote a very, very detailed introduction to this particular publication. But anyhow, de Brún was Monsignor de Brún was just a monster in the field. He was just a giant in the field, an extraordinary character. He was born in 1889, and he lived a long life. He died. I can't remember exactly the date that he died, but it was in the 40s sometime, I think, and. No, much later than that, actually. He died in the 60s, didn't he? But Monsignor de Brún was like a sort of a modern humanist. He was extraordinary. And nothing stopped him. And I couldn't go into all the things that he did in his life because we'd be here all day, but he had a particular interest in the revival of the Irish language. And he had he was bothered by a kind of a sorrow that Ireland had missed out on its Renaissance, and it had missed out on the Italian Renaissance coming over here, and translations of texts that had come out in the Renaissance and so on. And he wanted to emulate what he felt that humanists of the Renaissance period were doing. And he felt that our subjugation for 800 long years put paid to this, and he was determined to right this wrong. And he got into a battle with Daniel Corkery, who was a professor of English literature here in UCC at the time, and they fought about it in journal form for a while. Corkery wasn't having it. He wanted Irish to, a bit like what Kenneth was saying a minute ago about Irish not necessarily being the same type of vernacular as Italian was for Dante, because yes, it was the vernacular, but as Kenneth said, there was a two-tier kind of society when it came to language in Ireland. There was Caint na Níne, or the language of the people, and we know nothing about it because nobody bothered to write it down because they felt it was beneath them, because those who were literate they wrote in a particular register, a kind of a standard classical dialect of a very high register form of the Irish language. So anything we have surviving in Old and Middle Irish does not tell us how the people spoke. It is a kind of it is in a world of its own. So it is this high class standard classical literary dialect, as Kenneth was saying. And Corkery believed that we should we should concentrate on our native literature written in that language. But De Bruyn felt no way, this is not right. We need not to be an island. We need to be connected with Europe. And he translated an awful lot of classical texts and texts of the Renaissance into Irish. Antigone being one, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus in Igalone, Oedipus in Colonus, Athalie by Racine. He also translated Polyeucte by Corneille. He translated, let me look again at my list, Iphigenia by Euripides, and he, the comedy, of course, and he also was working on the Iliad around the time he died, and that has never been published. So De Bruyn's translation luckily, the Inferno is presented in both Italian and in Irish, which is very nice, but it is an extraordinary feat. It's really very difficult to do. And he has chosen to do it in as complex an Irish as he can muster. But he really, I suppose, brings across the register insofar as he can. Now, the second character we have to talk about today is Christopher O'Flynn. And Christopher is still with us. He's a friend of your family, I think, Daragh, isn't he? And is he in Dublin or no, Limerick?
He's in Dublin.
He's in Dublin. And this little pamphlet, Trí Gheataine Síoríochta, the Three Gates of Eternity, is a translation of the first canto in each of the three books of the Commedia. And he gives a little introduction, a little, I suppose, synopsis before each one. And his rationale for this, as he says in his own introduction, is being blasser and mugan. There is a great flavour to the small amount. The small amount is tasty. So he says, I want to give you a small bit of each of the three books. And that's what he does. And they are also extraordinary translations, quite different from the style of De Bruyn, being as they are much later in 1988. But what is interesting is, and I'd have to talk to him, and I haven't, but I think that he must be following, in relation to metre, he must be following what De Bruyn did. Because, and at this point, maybe I might share my screen and very quickly show you some examples of what I'm talking about. Because in terms of metre, the two of them do the same thing. And what we have here, hold on a second, actually I concentrate on this, I can't do two things at once. It is, let me see now, am I sharing it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Contrary to popular belief, not all women can multitask, and I certainly can't. So I can either put the slides up or I can talk one or the other. Anyhow, when De Bruyn went about his translation, he decided that the metre, the terza rime and the structures of the tercets in the Commedia were too important to leave aside completely. And he wasn't going to just do, like I suppose we have with the Mandelbaum's English prosy kind of translation, which is poetic, but it's still prose. And what he comes up with, and what Christopher O'Flynn then emulates later, is a kind of cultural hybridity when it comes to metre. He borrows a feature, but it's only a small feature, from the Irish metres that came about in the 17th century after the fall of the Gaelic order, with the completion and the culmination of the Tudor campaign in Ireland with the Battle of Kinsale in 1601 and 1607, the flight of the Earls, the flight of the Irish leaders, when over 100 of them left, and the poets found themselves with nobody to write for. And the syllabic metres that had been practiced by professional poets writing praise poetry, encomium, eulogy, and so on for their lords, these syllabic metres had been practiced for 1,000 years, up until 1601, 1607, thereabouts. These suddenly, they found no need for them. And a new type of metre came in. And this metre is known as the Auron metre, Auron meaning song. And it's the syllabic metres depended on a fixed number of syllables in the line, usually 7. They weren't stressed. Auron meters, on the other hand, were stressed and heavily assonated, the stress being on particular stressed vowels in the line. And a lot of these early Auron poems were ashling poems. They were vision poems, not visions like we have, like we've been talking about, but visions where the poet is asleep in a field at night and he wakes up to find a spare van. Here is a spare van actually in, I don't know if you can see that or not, but she is in Dublin, in Pembroke Street, a sculpture of the spare van, the woman of the ashling poetry. And this spare van is she personifies Ireland, and she's in trouble and she asks the poet for help and she talks to him and so on. And this is one of the most famous ashling poems we have. And you will see that the rhyming scheme is as follows, based on these stressed vowels. And I'll just read the verse to give you a sense of it. Gille na gille de honnerker schlie in oignes, crystal crystal risk reen oine. Binnis a vinisha frutal nor chreen ruama, dirgus finna de fionnach in a rees ruanav. So you can hear it's u, e, ua. 5 stresses and each one a vowel. And it doesn't matter what it means for our purposes. Now, this is Egon O'Rahele writing at the end of the 17th or beginning of the 18th century. Dovio Bruder then writing in the middle of the 17th century. This is a personal meditation towards the end of his life. It's an extraordinary poem and very, very moving poem, and also written in the Auron meter. But it is really about the state of Ireland. He's angry about the way things have changed in society, and he's very upset about his own poverty. And he says, "Is marig nor chan ramachas sleilte the changeler god dul nacha negentucht, sinanishim hacholasne hedlishne nach master garan and dad of kelegum." And you can hear there it's a simpler meter. It's a. Now, how does this relate to De Bruyn and O'Flynn's translations? Well, they didn't follow the entire, it would have been pretty tough going to do so, to write Auron throughout. So they leave the pattern of stressed vowels for the main part of the line. But the final foot is where they actually get down to business with this kind of hybrid thing. So what they do, the way their rhyming scheme is a hybrid kind of construction, is that they follow the pattern of the terza rima. So the middle, a line of one tercet, will rhyme with the first and third lines of the next. And you have this interlocking pattern, as you all know. So they follow that. But the way the rhyme works is according to the Auron style, where you have this stressed vowel. And the vowel might be a short vowel, a long vowel, or a diphthong. And as you can see here, you have 5 stresses in one, you have 4 stresses in the other, but it is all about stressed vowels. And if you consider considering or just looking at these rhymes in front of us, you see here that O'Rahele provides the final stressed syllable ua in words of 2 syllables. These are, so oignes is a disyllabic word, gruam is a disyllabic word. These are compound words here, reen and uine together, and grease and gruanav together, but that doesn't matter. They're compound words. They're both stressed, but this is the vowel sound that matters. So the compounds, the location of the stresses is independent of word breaks and compounds and so on. Now we find these kind of rhymes, as we find in Gille na Gille, throughout De Bruyn's and O'Flynn's translations. And I've put O'Flynn first because I suppose in chronologically, as far as the poem is concerned, look at Purgatorio first. So there is a mirroring of the type of schema in Gille na Gille here by O'Rahele and O'Flynn and De Bruyn's translations. So, for example, if you look here at oignes, for example, this dissyllable with the stress on the ua, here we have in Purgatory, Canto 1, which I'll read later, and you'll see these rhymes. And I promised you earlier, didn't I, that I'd give them all homework, and you're supposed to be looking out for these when we read it later. So Purgatory lines 38 to 42, the stressed vowel sound is a, and so it's gléinach, ternach, leirche. They are the rhymes of those 2 tercets together. And Pádraig De Bruyn in Paradiso 33, 107 to 11, the stressed vowel sound there is I, so liniv, shingel, rimish. And you'll notice that the rimish is not spelt, it's spelt differently. It isn't just the letter I. That doesn't matter. It's all about the sound. The orthography doesn't matter. Similarly, with this particular verse, Dovio Bruder's verse that we've just looked at, you will notice that the final foot is a dactyl. You will notice, though, that it's an A sound, but it's written A here, Eigentucht, Héadlisna, Céilagum, but here Sailta. It's the same sound, but the orthography is different. It's a different, the morphology of the word is different from the morphology of the others. And this type of rhyme where we have this dactylic, let's say, structure of the final foot turns up throughout the commedia as well, as does a trochaic version of the same thing, a trochee just being the long and the short. So to look then at a mirroring of this type of schema in Marag Norchran Ramaha Sealta by O'Bruader, we find the same thing, but no, I actually didn't find the dactylic usage in these poems. I just found the trochees, but it's the same idea. Here you can see the rhyme is in, let's say, Héadlisna is one word, but Céilagum is two words. And a gum is a kind of a word that can be stressed or unstressed, but in this case, it's unstressed. And here in Purgatory 1, 26 to 30, the stressed vowel sound is a. Now, this is pronounced as a diphthong in the south. So I'm from the south, so I pronounce these words as Neraunsa or Baulbjog Gafaunlog. And you can see there that you have one word here, but two words with the same idea. Here, Neraunsa or Baulbjog, but Gafaunlog. This is a compound, of course. And over here in Paradiso, Iasucht, Ieracht, Tiechtfos. These words are words within themselves. Tiechtfos, though, you have two words creating that troche. So, and that is the way the rhyme mirrors the schema in terms of the Auron meters. So what we find is the amalgamating of the two traditions, the Auron tradition, just a tiny part of it, the final foot of the line, with the pattern of the terza rima, which we don't have in Irish at all, even though Irish meter is extremely complex before this period. And then another thing that I noticed I've often read these cantos before for other Dante events over the years, and I've always noticed the translator's very fluid use, both of them actually, of dialect features in the rhyming scheme. And these must be recognized properly by the reader for the scheme to be conveyed properly to the ear. So if you're reading in your own dialect, let's say Southern dialect with the stress on the second syllable and so on, if it's a long syllable, that won't always work. If you read it just as somebody from Connemara or from the North would, it won't work either. You really have to sit down with it. So, for example, in Purgatory 1, 110 to 14, the stressed vowel sound is O. And the dialect stress pattern has to be Western or Northern. I can't read it as I would myself. If I were to read these three words myself in the way I would speak, I would say Mahori, Igoni, and Bochne. So the O vowel sound is lost. You have to read it as you would in the West or the North, Meshori, Igoni, Bochne, or else you lose it. And these lines are interlocked with 113, 15, and 17 in the same pair of tercets. And O'Flynn employs the pronunciation of the Southern dialect in the same. So you have to do Western or Northern with 110 to 14. But interlocked with that, you have to do Southern dialect or you won't get the rhyme either. So 113, Minshe, Ihe, Seilshach. If you were to pronounce the last word there as it would be pronounced in other dialects in the West, for example, you would lose the rhyme, the Auron rhyme of the stressed vowel, because it would sound like this: Minshe, Ihe, Seilshach. So you have to say it in the Southern way. So there are two dialects being mixed there. Then in Paradiso over on the right-hand side in 33, 77 to 81, the stressed vowel sound there is oo, and you have to pronounce it. Again, you have to use the Southern way of pronouncing the words here, because again, if you're to make the rhyme work, you have to say it Skahuili, and you'll hear this later if you're listening. Skahuili, Dohjunsen, Nasulse. If you were to pronounce that as it were pronounced maybe in the West, it would be Skahuili, Dohjunsen, Nasulse. So Kyun would lose that oo rhyme, that oo, stressed oo vowel there. So you're constantly having to run in and out of different dialects. Now, I'm aware that time is flying and I don't want to talk any more about that, but that should more or less give you a sense of what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you, Emma. I think this perhaps is if you wouldn't mind stop sharing your screen there, Emma.
I thought I had. Oh, sorry.
Thanks a million. And I just want to thank Emma and Kenneth for this opening part of our dialogue, because it really is fascinating. I mean, I could spend the whole evening talking to the both of them about these things, because they really are fascinating. However, time is pressing, and we're going to move on to our middle section now, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Elliot Murphy. Now, for those of you who don't know Elliot Murphy, I was very lucky at the end of last September to sneak in through the back door to the premiere of his Inferno for cello that was premiered in Dublin Castle in the presence of the President of Ireland. And it really was a fantastic event, because in the background he was surrounded by Liam O'Brien's wonderful lithographs that were also being exhibited there at the same time. It was an extraordinary work, and when I reached out to Elliot to say would he come on this evening and have a little chat with us, he agreed immediately. So without further ado, Elliot, are you there?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So Elliot, I suppose, I mean, you're connecting to us this evening from Berlin, where you're working and composing. But could you just, I suppose, basically, why Dante? What was it about Dante that drew you, first of all, to the poem, but and also to consider composing out of that?
Well, it was actually my dad who gave me a copy of Inferno when I moved to Berlin, and that was 3 years ago now. And when reading Inferno, it just struck me how vivid everything felt, despite it being a text which is 700 years old. I guess I was biased maybe in thinking what I might experience when reading it the first time. But no, I was just struck by how vivid everything was, and the atmosphere in Inferno is just extraordinary. And so I couldn't help but hear music while I was reading it. And whenever that happens, I really love having an extra musical thing to kind of guide me through a composition, or it's nice to have some kind of input from outside to give you ideas. And yeah, the poem was just full of these nuggets. And so I just decided to go for it, and just to start rendering parts of it and seeing if it would work. Initially, I wanted just to write a piece for solo cello. That was my idea at the time. So I thought I might do that first. But very quickly, I found that was not sufficient. And the type of music that I was writing was much bigger or much more atmospheric in scope. And it just wouldn't have worked on solo cello. There's only so much that you can achieve with a solo cello. And I found that the material that I was writing was good enough to go in that direction. So everything just ended up being bigger, essentially. And so then I had a problem of still wanting to write a piece for myself to perform, but now I was writing material that suited better a larger ensemble. So what I decided to do was to record all of these parts myself and to play them live using software, using a laptop. So I would still have then the benefit of performing this piece myself, but also having this bigger sound to suit the composition. Now that there's when people perform with these backing tracks, it can often be quite boring, because it's exactly the same every single time that you play back the piece. And so I wanted to avoid that. So it was nice knowing that at the beginning of the process, because I wanted to write my way out of that problem. So I decided to use this technique, which was pioneered by a Polish composer, Ludosławski. It's called aleatoricism, or aleatoric music. And what it is a kind of controlled chants. So if I can give a basic example, if you think of a audience and they are giving an applause after a performance of some kind, if you think about what that sound actually is, it's a lot of different individuals clapping independent rhythms together. But the sound that you hear is just one sound. So if you have one person clapping, it's just one rhythm. If you add another person to that, you have a polyrhythm, and a third, it gets a little bit more complex, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth. And then there comes a certain point when that sound ceases to be a collection of individual things, and it becomes one big thing, or an applause in this case. And so if you take that idea and then apply it to music, you can create all of these kind of interesting textures, as it were. And seeing that this poem is such an epic journey, it seems like a good technique to use to kind of paint these landscapes, as it were. And so that's kind of the decision that I made of the form of the piece. I wanted it to feel like a journey. And so painting these landscapes with these aleatoric textures as I went seemed the right way to go. And so then live, how that works is, I'll show you an example in a minute. I can trigger these kind of passages and textures that happen in the background, and then I can improvise over the top of them melodically. So I kind of like to think of it as my live cello is kind of the voice of Dante, or the protagonist, and the background is everything that he is experiencing on the journey. So I find it very interesting when Emma was talking about Dante in the first person, because that's very much how we experience it as a reader, and Dante even refers to the reader at certain points during the poem. So it feels very personal. So that's the kind of that I wanted to express that feeling musically in this piece. So that was the idea.
Yeah, I mean, because I was at this performance, and you and I had a little chat afterwards, and the sensation that I got from it was actually being on a journey, and like what you're saying, the lead cello being the kind of first person narrator. I find that absolutely fascinating. And there was a sense of disorientation about it. You never knew what was happening next, and I mean, my pulse was changing with great regularity. I mean, and it very much was a journey, because I mean, you can say, well, hell, it's all discordant voices, it's all cacophony, it's all atonal, and you can just do it like this. But like you're saying, this layering technique, this texture technique, and then the improvised cello on top of it, I just thought was a fascinating way to go about it. And were there particular moments within the text which made you pause to think, well, actually here I need to do something very different, or is there anything that kind of stood out for you in that context?
Yeah, well, that's a very easy trap to fall into if you start painting everything with the same brush. You could paint the whole piece as this kind of dark and discordant landscape, but if this piece is an hour long, it would render itself quite boring if it was that way for the whole thing. So musically, I had to find places where I could do something different. So one place in particular that I did something differently was, let me find it for you. The counselors. Yeah, where everyone is trapped inside these individual flames. And the image that I had of this location was when Dante first walks over this ditch or hill or whatever it is, and he sees these flames. I thought of this effect that you see sometimes where in the distance, if something is very hot, you have this kind of shimmering mirage effect in the distance. And I thought I would kind of focus on that rather than the kind of emptiness of this ditch, because there's no immediately apparent people in this place. You just see these flames, so it feels much emptier than previous areas. So the music here is much more gentle, and it's much more focused on harmony rather than the chaos that came beforehand. For example, with the demons in the with the bariters in the Lake of Tar. This is quite a stark contrast to that. And also, this is nearing the end of the piece, so I wanted to kind of give some space for the things that come right at the end. It would lose some impact if I had everything staying at the same level. So a little dip here during this section. So that's one example, I guess.
Brilliant. So could you show us a couple of these techniques then?
Yeah, of course. Okay, let me know if you can see this.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I go back to the very beginning, I think it's a good example. So like I was explaining with this applause example, you have this, I have very small musical ideas inside each one of these little boxes. So for example, if I play this first one, you'll hear how it sounds. Is this audio working for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's actually 3 cellos in this one little audio box. And if I add another 2 and a third one and a fourth one, they start layering on top of each other. And now all of a sudden we have a texture and we have an atmosphere. So I can then start to improvise on top of this. Melodically, and I guess narratively is how I would say I improvised throughout the piece. And so the nice thing about playing live this way is that it's not just a straight backing track. I can change this at any point. So if I feel that this is going on too long, I'll just treat it and I'll have some new harmony coming in. And now this will bring me in a new direction. And now I don't know if you can see, I have 3 events here at the beginning for the leopard and the lion and the wolf when he meets these animals. So just a warning that this is quite loud if you are listening. So now everything keeps building up on top of each other. We'll bring in the next one. After each shot, I have a new opportunity to play something different. And then ultimately at the end, Virgil's chord kind of comes and brings him out of this journey. So yeah, that's kind of an example of how it works practically live.
And am I right in saying then that practically all of the sounds that the music that you're producing are coming from the instrument of the cello, yeah?
Yeah, 90% is cello. And then a friend of mine, Patricia, recorded some violin, and I recorded double bass and percussion as well, just for some textural variety, because the cello, as good as it is at doing a huge number of things, it kind of drops out in the low end and it's missing something in its high frequencies. So just having these extra 2 things fills it out a little bit more and makes it feel a bit more complete sonically.
Wonderful. Now, the obvious question before we're going to play a clip from the premiere is, what about the Purgatorio and the Paradiso?
I have thought about it. I think I would like to wait a while to do both of those. Well, firstly, because it took a long time to do this one, and I'm quite exhausted after being in hell for a year.
Yeah.
But I think it would be interesting to wait until maybe my style changes a little bit and to approach Purgatorio and Paradiso from a completely different viewpoint or stance or something. And so just to have something, just to have a variety, I guess, and not to do the exact same thing for the other 2 pieces. If they're going, and they will obviously be as big a challenge as this one musically. So I think, yeah, that's my plan, I guess. Definitely.
So Elliot, what I thought we'd do is Dario is waiting in the wings here to put up. We're gonna play a 5-minute segment from the video recording of the concert in Dublin Castle, just to give everybody a feeling of what this was really like. And you can see Limo Brin's lithographs in the background. Dario, will you take it away there?
Yeah. Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, wow. That was, listen, I know we're all online, but that was absolutely astounding. Elliot, before I let you off the hook here, could you just tell us when is the recording of this going to be available and how can we get our hands on it?
So the album's in post-production at the moment, and hoping to have it ready for the start of the new year. But if you go to my website, elliotmurphymusic.com, you can sign up to my mailing list there, and I will let you know when it's happening, and you can also find details there as well.
Brilliant. So that's elliotmurphymusic.com.
Yes, 2 L's, 1 T.
Okay.
Thank you.
Elliot, thank you. That was
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Nice. Okay, now we're going to just change track slightly. Before we get into the kind of official readings of things, I'm going to invite my colleague Martín Veiga to come and say a few words, because sadly Dante's Galician translator Dario Cabana recently passed, and Martín is going to say a few words. Martín.
Yes, thank you very much, Dante. Not Dante, but Daragh. And I'm really, really moved by Elliot's performance. It was really a fantastic moment. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I was illuminated also by Emma and Kenneth's discussions earlier. So congratulations, Daragh, on a wonderful event and on a great trajectory for the Dante Center and for the team. It has been great. Thank you also for giving me the opportunity to talk about Dario Cabana, who died 3 weeks ago. And he was a well-established, very well-known poet and novelist in Galicia. But importantly, he devoted pretty much his last 40 or 45 years to translation, mostly of Italian classics. So he translated the Commedia into Galician, but also translated Dante's Vita Nuova, Petrarch's Canzoniere, an anthology of Dolce Stil Nuovo, and other texts of that tradition. I think it's very important to highlight that he translated the Commedia twice into Galician, and both times in decasyllables and in terza rima. His first translation was published in 1990, and it was the first ever translation into Galician on the book of the book. So I suppose it has that kind of additional merit. And then in 2014, so 14 years later, he published a revised translation, or a retranslation, I suppose, because of the more than 14,000 lines of the poem, 14,233, more than 7,000 lines are different in the new version. So it was like a massive enterprise again. I also wanted to highlight the fact that his translations had a very positive reception and recognition, both in the Iberian context, but also in Italy. In 1991, after publishing the first translation of the Commedia, he received the gold medal of the city of Florence, and he was very moved by that recognition. And in 2013, just before the publication of the second one, he was invited to participate in the Settembre Dantesco activities in Ravenna, where he read his Galician version of Canto 6 of the Purgatorio, that was also read in Italian by Alessandro Sorrentino. So, you know, that is Dario Cabana. I think that photo on the right hand side there is that moment when he went to Ravenna, and the picture in the middle is the second version of his Commedia. So, I mean, I think it's great that Daragh gave me, or gave Dario Cabana, a small bit of space in this as part of this event to kind of recognize his amazing contribution to Dante and to Dante's work.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's hugely significant. So what we're going to do now, as a way of kind of starting off our readings, I'm going to ask Leyla Livraghi to read from the Ulysses passage. Elliot was mentioning there the fraudulent counsellors, and this is the great Ulysses speech. And then Martín is going to read in the Galician for us. Leyla, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, so by the way, that's Limo Brin's wonderful depiction of Canto 26 of the Inferno. Leyla, a te la
Okay, I'm ready. I'm gonna start. Lo maggior corno della fiamma antica cominciò a crollarsi mormorando, pur come quella cui vento affatica. Indi la cima a quella menando, come fosse la lingua che parlasse, gittò voce di fuori e disse: quando mi dipartì da Circe che sottrasse me più d'un anno là presso a Gaeta, prima che si Enea la nomasse, né dolcezza di figlio, né la pietà del vecchio padre, né il debito amore lo qual dovea Penelope far lieta, vincer potero dentro a me l'ardore, ch'io ebbi a divenir del mondo esperto, e dei vizi umani e del valore. Ma misi me per l'alto mare aperto, sol con un legno e con quella compagna picciola, dalla qual non fui diserto. L'ullito e l'altro vidi in fila a Spagna, Finner Morrocco e l'isola di Sardi, e l'altre che quel mare intorno bagna. Io e i compagni eravam vecchi e tardi, quando venimmo a quella foce stretta, dove Ercule segnò i suoi riguardi, a ciò che l'uom più oltre non si metta. Dalla man destra mi lasciai Sibilia, dall'altra già m'avea lasciata Setta. O frati, dissi, che per 100 miglia perigli siete giunti all'Occidente, a questa tanto picciola vigilia, di nostri sensi chieder rimanente, non vogliate negar l'esperienza, di retro al sol del mondo senza gente. Considerate la vostra semenza, fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. Li miei compagni fec'io si aguti, con questo razion picciola al cammino, che appena poscia li avrei ritenuti, e volta nostra poppa nel mattino, dei remi facemmo ali al folle volo, sempre acquistando dal lato mancino. Tutte le stelle già dell'altro polo vedea la notte e il nostro tanto basso che non surgea fuor del marinsuolo. 5 volte era acceso e tante casso lo lume era di sotto dalla luna, poiché entrati eravan nell'alto passo. Quando n'apparve una montagna bruna per la distanza e parvemi alta tanto quanto veduta non avea alcuna. Noi ci allegrammo e tosto tornò in pianto, che della nuova terra un turbo nacque e percosse del legno il primo canto. 3 volte il fe girar con tutte l'acque, alla quarta levar la poppa in suso e la prora ira in giù, come altrui piacque, infin che il mar fu sovra noi richiuso.
Grazie. Martín.
O maior corno desta lapantira comezou a axitarse murmurando, como a que o aire ao ventear fatiga. Despois apunta aquí e alá abalando, como se fose lingua que falase, botou para fora voz e dixo: cando deixei a Circe, que 2 anos case metivo onde Gaeta, antes do día que deste modo Eneas lle chamase, nin dozura de fillo, nin a pía dirección do pai vello, nin o amor que alegrar a Penélope debía, puideron apagar en min o ardor que concibín por ser no mundo experto e nos humanos vicios e valor. Senón que entrei por alto mar aberto, cun barco soamente e coa compaña pequena pola que eu non fun deserto. Eu vin ata Marrocos e ata España cada costa, e Sardeña e as demais illas que o noso mar en torno baña. Xa estaba vello e lento como os máis, cando demos chegado á foz estreita, onde Hércules plantou os seus sinais, para que ninguén traspase aquela freita. Tal como a esquerda, Ceuta e os seus lidos, deixei despois Sevilla á man dereita. Oh, irmáns, dixen eu, que sodes vivos, que sodes vidos entre 100.000 perigos ao occidente, a tan breve vixilia que os sentidos nosos lles queda xa de remanente. Negar non lle queirades a experiencia, seguindo o sol do mundo xa sen xente. Considerade a vosa procedencia para vivir como a brutos non creados, si para buscar virtude e coñecencia. Deixei os compañeiros tan bezados con esta breve arenga en ir para adiante, que malos podería ter parados, e volta a nosa popa pro levante, fixémoslle as cos remos ao botolo, sempre de cara ao lado esquerdo avante. Xa vía a noite os astros do outro polo e o noso tan abaixo declinara que non xurdía do mariño solo. 5 veces prendera e se apagara baixo da lúa o seu visible lume, des que o noso alto paso se iniciara, cando vimos un monte entre o negrume da gran distancia, e levantaba tanto que eu non vira xamais tan alto cume. Pronto a alegría se volveu en pranto, da nova terra un turbillón se alzou e deulle ao leño no dianteiro canto. 3 veces cando as augas o virou, a cuarta ergueulle a popa cara arriba e arfou a proa como o tren mandou, ata que o mar se nos cerrou en riba.
Thank you, Martín. Okay, now to round off this evening's event, we thought we'd finish with a variety of readings in Italian, in English, and lastly in Irish. Now, the selections of which translation into English was quite difficult, and for reasons of time, we haven't included Kieran Carson's wonderful Inferno. However, the 3 that we've chosen here in English reflect, I think, a certain symmetry. Seamus Heaney, as we've already mentioned before, famously translated the Ugolino episode from Inferno 33 in his collection Fieldwork. And by happy coincidence, Matthew Sweeney, who sadly passed a number of years ago, who was one-time writer in residence here in ECC, translated in 2000 a section of Inferno 32. And obviously our Cork poet Bernard O'Donoghue, alongside other exquisitely beautiful translations of Dante, completed 33 with the Fra Alberigo episode. So we're going to do this in the following way. Elsina, Dario, and Valentina are going to read 32 and 33 straight through. And then I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Dr. Mary Noonan, herself a poet of international renown, and Matthew's partner, and she will read Matthew's In the Ice. Next, we're going to have Dr. Jason Harris, who's very kindly agreed to read Heaney's Ugolino, and then Kenneth will read Bernard's. So I'm going to pass over then to Elsina.
Come noi fummo giù nel pozzo scuro, sotto i piedi del gigante assai più bassi, e io mirava ancora all'alto muro. Dicere udimi, guarda come passi, va sì, che tu non calchi con le piante le teste dei fratei miseri lassi. Perch'io mi volsi e vidimi davante e sotto i piedi un lago che per gelo avea di vetro e non d'acqua sembiante. Non fece al corso suo sì grosso velo d'inverno la danoia in osterlicchi, ne tanai là sotto il freddo cielo com'era quivi, che se tambernicchi vi fosse succaduto o pietrapana, non avria pur da l'orlo fatto cricchi. E come a gracidarsi sta la rana col muso fuor dell'acqua, quando sogna di spigolar sovente la villana, livide insin là dove appar vergogna, eran l'ombre dolenti nella ghiaccia, mettendo i denti in nota di cicogna. Ognuna in giù tenea volta la faccia, da bocca il freddo e dagli occhi il cor tristo, tra lor testimonianza si procaccia. Quand'io m'ebbi d'intorno alquanto visto, volsimi ai piedi e vidi 2 sì stretti, che il pel del capo avieno insieme misto. Ditemi, voi che sì strignete i petti, diss'io, chi siete? E quei piegaro i colli, e poi che berli visi a me eretti, gli occhi lor, che eran pria pur dentro molli, gocciar su per le labbra, e il gelo strinse le lagrime tra essi e rise rolli. Con legno spranga mai non cinse, forte così, ond'ei come 2 becchi cozzaro insieme, tanta ira li vinse. E un che avea perduti ambo gli orecchi per la freddura, pur col viso in giù disse, perché cotanto in noi ti specchi? Se vuoi saper chi son cotesti 2, la valle onde Visenzio si dichina, del padre loro Alberto e di lor fue. D'un corpo usciro, e tutta la Caina potrai cercare, e non troverai ombra degna più d'esser fitta in gelatina. Non quelli a cui fu rotto il petto e l'ombra, con esso un colpo per la mandar tu. Non focaccia, non questi che mi ingombra col capo sì, ch'io non veggio più oltre più. E fu nomato Sassol Mascheroni. Se tosco se, ben sai omai chi fu. E perché non mi metti in più sermoni, sappi chi fu il camicion de pazzi, e aspetto Carlin che mi scagioni. Poscia vidio 1000 visi, cagnazzi, fatti per freddo, onde mi vien riprezzo e verrà sempre de gelati guazzi. E mentre ch'andavamo in verlo mezzo, al quale ogni gravezza si rauna, e io tremava nell'eterno rezzo, se voler fu, o destino, o fortuna, non so, ma passeggiando tra le teste, forte percossi il piè nel viso ad una. Piangendo mi sgridò: perché mi peste? Se tu non vieni a crescer la vendetta di Montaperti, perché mi moleste? E io: maestro mio, or qui m'aspetta, sicch'io esca d'un dubbio per costui. Poi mi farai quantunque vorrai, fretta. Lo duca stette, e io dissi a colui che bestemmiava duramente ancora: qual sei tu che così rampogni altrui? Or tu chi sei che vai per l'antenora percotendo, rispose, altrui le gote, sicché se fossi vivo, troppo fora. Vivo son io, e caro esser ti puote, fu mia risposta, se dimandi fama, che io metta il nome tuo tra l'altre note. Ed egli a me: del contrario io brama, levati quinci e non mi dar più lagna, che mal sai lusingar per questa lama. Allor lo presi per la cuticagna e dissi: el converrà che tu ti nomi o che capel qui su non ti rimagna. Ondelli a me: perché tu mi dischiomi, né ti dirò ch'io sia, né mostrerolti, se 1000 fiate in sul capo mi tomi. Io avea già i capelli in mano avvolti e tratti gliene avea più d'una ciocca, latrando lui con gli occhi in giù raccolti, quando un altro gridò: che hai tu, bocca? Non ti basta suonar con le mascelle, se tu non latri? Qual diavol ti tocca? Omai, diss'io, non vuò che tu favelle, malvagio traditor, che alla tua onta io porterò di te vere novelle. Va via, rispose, e ciò che tu vuoi conta, ma non tacer, se tu di qua dentro eschi, di quel ch'ebbe or così la lingua pronta. El piange qui l'argento de Franceschi. Io vidi, potrai dir, quel da Duera, là dove i peccatori stanno freschi. Se fossi domandato altri chi vera, tu hai dal lato quel di Beccheria, di cui segò Fiorenza la gorgiera. Gianni de Soldanier credo che sia più là con Ganellone e Tebaldello, c'aprì Faenza quando si dormia. Noi eravamo partiti già da Ello, ch'io vidi 2 ghiacciati in una buca, sicché il capo all'altro era cappello. E come il pan per fame si manduca, così il sovran li denti all'altro pose, lave il cervel s'aggiugne con la nuca. Non altrimenti ti deo si rose le tempie a Melanippo per disdegno, che quei facea il teschio e l'altre cose. O tu che mostri per sì bestial segno odio sovra colui che tu ti mangi, dimmi il perché, diss'io, per tal convegno, che se tu a ragion di lui ti piangi, sappiendo chi voi siete, la sua pecca, nel mondo s'uso ancor io te ne cangi, se quella con ch'io parlo non si secca.
La bocca sollevò dal fiero pasto quel peccator, forbendo la capelli del capo ch'egli avea di retroguasto. Poi cominciò: tu vuò ch'io rinovelli disperato dolor che il cor mi preme, già pur pensando pria ch'io ne favelli. Ma se le mie parole esser dien seme, che frutti infami al traditor chi rodo, parlare e lagrimar vedrai insieme. Io non so chi tu sei, né per che modo venuto sei qua giù, ma fiorentino mi sembri veramente quand'io todo. Tu dei saper chi fui conte Ugolino, e questi è l'arcivescovo Ruggeri, or ti dirò perché io son tal vicino, che per l'effetto de suoi mai pensieri, fidandomi di lui, io fossi preso e poscia morto, dir non è mestieri. Però quel che non puoi avere inteso, cioè come la morte mia fu cruda, udirai e saprai se m'ha offeso. Breve pertugio dentro dalla muda, la qual per me ha il titol della fame, e che conviene ancor ch'altrui si chiuda, m'avea mostrato per lo suo forame più lune già, quand'io feci il mal sonno che del futuro mi squarciò il velame. Questi pareva a me maestro e donno, cacciando il lupo e lupicini al monte, perché i pisan veder Lucca non ponno. Con cagne magre, studiose e conte, gualandi con Sismondi e con Lanfranchi, s'avea mezzi dinanzi dalla fonte. In picciol corso mi parieno stanchi lo padre e figli, e con l'agute scane mi parea lor veder fenderli fianchi. Quando fui desto innanzi la dimane, pianger sentì fra il sonno i miei figliuoli, ch'eran con meco, e dimandar del pane. Ben se crudel se tu già non ti duoli, pensando ciò che il mio cor s'annunziava, e se non piangi, di che pianger suoli? Già eran desti, e l'ora s'appressava che il cibo ne solea essere addotto, e per suo sogno ciascun dubitava, e io sentì chiavar l'uscio di sotto all'orribile torre, ond'io guardai nel viso a miei figliuoi senza far motto. Io non piangea, sì dentro impetrai, piangevan elli, e Anselmuccio mio disse: tu guardi sì, padre, che hai? Perciò non lagrimai, né risposi io tutto quel giorno, né la notte appresso, infin che l'altro sol nel mondo uscio. Come un poco di raggio si fu messo nel doloroso carcere, e io scorsi per 4 visi il mio aspetto stesso, ambo le man per lo dolor mi morsi, ed ei, pensando ch'io il fessi per voglia di manicar, di subito levorsi e disser: padre, assai ci fia mendoglia se tu mangi di noi. Tu ne vestisti queste misere carni e tu le spoglia. Quetami allor, per non farli più tristi. L'udì e l'altro stemmo tutti muti. Ahi, dura terra, perché non t'apristi? Poscia che fummo al quarto dì venuti, Gaddo mi si gittò disteso a piedi, dicendo: padre mio, che non m'aiuti? Quivi morì. E come tu mi vedi, vid'io cascarli 3 ad uno tra il quinto dì e il sesto, ond'io mi diedi già cieco a brancolar sovra ciascuno, e 2 dì li chiamai, poiché fur morti. Poscia, più che il dolor, poté il digiuno. Quando ebbe detto ciò con gli occhi torti, riprese il teschio misero codenti, che furo all'osso come d'un can forti. Ahi, Pisa, vituperio delle genti del bel paese là dove il sì suona, poiché i vicini a te punir son lenti, muovasi la capraia e la gorgona e faccian siepe a darno in su la foce, sicch'elli annieghi in te ogni persona. Che se il conte Ugolino aveva voce d'aver tradita te delle castella, non dovei tui figliuoi porre a tal croce. Innocenti, facea l'età novella Tebe, Uguiccione il Brigata e gli altri due, che il canto suso appella.
Noi passammo oltre, là ove la gelata, ruvidamente un'altra gente fascia, non volta in giù, ma tutta riversata. Lo pianto stesso lì pianger non lascia, e il duol, che trova in su gli occhi rintoppo, si volve in entro a far crescer l'ambascia, che le lacrime prima fanno groppo, e sì, come visiere di cristallo, riempion sotto il ciglio tutto il coppo. E avvegna che, siccome d'un callo, per la freddura ciascun sentimento cessato avesse dal mio viso stallo, già mi parea sentire alquanto vento. Perch'io, maestro mio, questo chi move, non è qua giù ogni vapor spento? Ed egli a me, avaccio sarai dove di ciò ti farà l'occhio la risposta, veggendo la cagion che il fiato piove. E unde tristi della fredda crosta gridò a noi, o anime crudeli, tanto che datave l'ultima posta, levatemi dal viso i duri veli, sicch'io sfoghi il duol che il cor mi impregna, un poco, pria che il pianto si raggeli. Perch'io a lui, se vuoi ch'io ti sovegna, dimmi chi è, dimmi chi sei, e s'io non ti disbrigo, al fondo della ghiaccia, ir mi convegna. Rispose adunque, i son frate Alberigo, io son quel dalle frutta del malorto, che qui riprendo dattero per figo. Oh, diss'io lui, or sei tu ancor morto? Ed egli a me, come il mio corpo stea nel mondo su, nulla scienza porto. Cotal vantaggio a questa Tolomea, che spesse volte l'anima ci cade, innanzi Catropos mossa l'idea. E perché tu più volontier mi rade, le invetriate lacrime dal volto, sappi che, tosto che l'anima trade, come feci io, il corpo suo le tolto, da un demonio, che poscia il governa, mentre che il tempo suo tutto sia volto. Ella rovina in sì fatta cisterna, e forse pare ancora lo corpo suso, dell'ombra che di qua dietro mi verna. Tu il dei saper, se tu vien pur moggiuso. Egli esser branca d'oria, e son più anni poscia passati che il fussi racchiuso. Io credo, diss'io lui, che tu mi inganni, che Branca d'Oria non morì unquanche, e mangia e bee e dorme e veste panni. Nel fosso su, diss'el, de male branche, là dove bolle la tenace pece, non era ancora giunto Michel Zanche, che questi lasciò il diavolo in sua vece, nel corpo suo e un suo prossimano, che il tradimento insieme con lui fece. Ma distendi oggimai in qua la mano, aprimi gli occhi, e io non gliela persi, e cortesia fu lui esser villano. Ai genovesi, uomini diversi, d'ogni costume e pien d'ogni magagna, perché non siete voi del mondo spersi? Che col peggiore spirito di Romagna trovai di voi un tale che, per sopra, in anima di cocito, già si bagna, e in corpo par vivo ancor di sopra.
Wonderful. And now we're going to pass over to the Irish version of these three moments. Mary.
Hi. Matthew's version, in fact, it claims to be Canto 32, lines 16 to 139, but in fact, Matthew's poem, as you'll see, is, is only 70 lines long, so it's a version, and as you can see, it's in a block as well. He doesn't stick to the tercets. Okay. In the ice. When we were down in the dark hole, far beneath the giant's feet, and I was still looking up at the wall, I heard a voice say, "Watch out, mind you don't tramp on the heads of your miserable, weary brothers." I turned and saw I was walking on a frozen lake, the ice far thicker than the Danube ever gets, or Don, so thick Everest could fall on it without making a crack. And as a frog sits with its head out of water to croak, So these ghosts were stuck up to their necks in the ice, each making a noise like a stork and keeping his face hidden. I saw at my feet two melded together so much they had the one hair. Tell me, I said, who you are. They raised their faces and cried tears that froze at once, locking their eyes. Then they butted each other. And one who'd lost both his ears to the cold asked, "Why do you stare at us?" Those, if you want to know, were twins, treacherous brothers who killed each other. But we're all treacherous here. Then I saw 1,000 faces turned to dogs' faces by the cold, as, shivering, I walked through the heads and straight into one. The shouts of it. "What are you doing, tramping on me? What have I ever done on you?" "Who do you think you are," I said, "to speak like that? Look at yourself." "No, who are you?" he answered, walking here, kicking me in the face. "I'm alive," I said, "and if you want fame, I can get it for you. What's your name?" "Fame is the last thing I want. Fuck off and don't annoy me further. Flattery doesn't work down here." I took him by the hair and said, "Give me your name or I'll bold you." "Do if you want, but I still won't say who I am." I tore out a handful, then another, and he barked like a dog. "What's wrong, Bucca?" another shouted. Are your grinding teeth not enough for you? What devil's making you bark?" "Ha! You can keep quiet now," I said, "for despite you, I know who you are." "Fuck off," he answered. "Tell what you will, but tell about that fucker who spoke too. Say you saw Buoso in the place where the sinners are sent to freeze. And if you're asked who else was there, you can name a certain papal legate whose throat Florence slit. Also one Gianni de Soldanier and Ganelon and Tribaldetto. Traitors, every fucking one." We'd gone on ahead when I saw two frozen in the one hole, one's teeth clamped on the other's head. "What kind of show of hatred is this?" I asked. "What has this fellow done to make you want to eat him? Tell me, and I'll avenge you in the upper world, if my tongue will still be able to speak."
Thanks, Mary. Thank you. Jason.
Yeah, so this is Seamus Heaney's translation of Ugolino from Inferno 32 and 33. We had already left him. I walked the ice and saw two soldered in a frozen hole on top of other, one's skull capping the other's, gnawing at him where the neck and head are grafted to the sweet fruit of the brain, like a famine victim at a loaf of bread. So the berserk Tydeus gnashed and fed upon the severed head of Menalippus, as if it were some spattered carnal melon. "You," I shouted, "you on top. What hate makes you so ravenous and insatiable? What keeps you so monstrously at rut? Is there any story I can tell for you in the world above against him? If my tongue by then's not withered in my throat, I will report the truth and clear your name." That sinner eased his mouth up off his meal to answer me and wiped it with the hair left growing on his victim's ravaged skull, and then said, even before I speak. The thought of having to relive all that desperate time makes my heart sick, yet while I weep to say them, I would sow my words like curses, that they might increase and multiply upon this head I know. I know you come from Florence by your accent, but I've no idea who you are, nor how you ever managed your descent. Still, you should know my name, for I was Count Ugolino. This was Archbishop Roger, and why I act the jockey to his mount is surely common knowledge. How my good faith was easy prey to his malignancy. How I was taken, held, and put to death. But you must hear something you cannot know if you're to judge him. The cruelty of my death at his hands. So listen now. Others will pine as I pined in that jail which is called hunger after me, and watch as I watched through a narrow hole, moon after moon, bright and somnambulant, pass overhead, until that night I dreamt the bad dream, and my future's veil was rent. I saw a wolf hunt. This man rode the hill between Pisa and Lucca, hounding down the wolf and wolf cubs. He was lordly and masterful, his pack in keen condition, his company deployed ahead of him, Gualandi and Sismondi as well, and Lanfranchi, who soon wore down wolf father and wolf sons. And my hallucination was all sharp teeth and bleeding flanks ripped open. When I awoke before the dawn, my head swam with cries of my sons, who slept in tears beside me there, crying out for bread. If your sympathy is not already started at all that my heart was for suffering, and if you're not crying, you are hard-hearted. They were awake now. It was near the time for food to be brought in, as usual, each one of them disturbed after his dream. When I heard the door being nailed and hammered shut far down in the nightmare tower, I stared in my sons' faces and spoke no word. My eyes were dry and my heart was stony. They cried, and my little Anselm said, "What's wrong? Why are you staring, Daddy?" But I shed no tears. I made no reply all through that day, all through the night that followed, until another sun blushed in the sky and sent a small beam probing the distress inside those prison walls. Then when I saw the image of my face in their four faces, I bit on my two hands in desperation, and they, since they thought hunger drove me to it, rose up suddenly in agitation, saying, "Father, it will greatly ease our pain if you eat us instead, and you who dressed us in this sad flesh, undress us here again." So then I calmed myself to keep them calm. We hushed. That day and the next stole past us, and earth seemed harder against me and them. For 4 days we let the silence gather. Then, throwing himself flat in front of me, Gaddo said, "Why don't you help me, Father?" He died like that. And surely as you see me here, one by one, I saw my 3 drop dead during the 5th day and the 6th day, until I saw no more. Searching, blinded, for 2 days I groped over them and called them. Then hunger killed where grief had only wounded. When he had said all this, his eyes rolled and his teeth, like a dog's teeth clamping round a bone, bit into the skull, and again took hold. Pisa, Pisa, your sounds are like a hiss sizzling in our country's grassy language. And since the neighbor states have been remiss in your extermination, let a huge dike of islands bar the Arno's mouth. Let Capraia and Gorgona dam and deluge you and your population, for the sins of Ugolino, who betrayed your forts, should never have been visited on his sons. Your atrocity was Theban. They were young and innocent, Hugh and Brigata, and the other two, whose names are in my song.
Wonderful. Kenneth.
Fra Alberico's Bad Fruit from Outliving, Bernard O'Donoghue, 2003. On we went till we reached a place where frost remorselessly confined another group, whose heads didn't look down, but were stuck twisted backwards. It was crying itself that hindered their ability to cry, and the misery impacted at their eyes of ice, ingrown, intensified the agony. Because the first tears would freeze into a knot and, like hard glass, opaque contact lenses filled up the whole space under the eyelids. And though the frost had taken every ounce of feeling from my face, making it like solid muscle to the fingers, I thought now I felt some touch of breeze and asked, Master, where can this have come from? Surely no wind is active in these depths. Virgil answered, soon we'll reach a place where you'll see with your own eyes the source from which this strange current reaches us. Then one of those suffering from the frozen eye crust called out to us, you two souls, so evil that you're on your way to the utmost depths of hell, peel off, I beg of you, the hard veils from my face, so I can release to some extent the grief trapped in my heart before the tears freeze over again. I said to him, if you want me to do this, tell me who you are. And if I do not then anoint your eyes, may I indeed have to go to the iciest part of hell. All right, he said, I'm Alberigo, the jovial friar, who called for fruit as the agreed signal to kill. Now I'm fed here with an even sourer fruit. But I asked him, are you then dead already? He answered, I can't speak for what is happening to my physical body in the world above, but it's a privilege of this Ptolemaic hell that often souls fall down into its depths before death has severed them from life. And to persuade you more readily to remove the jagged glass tears off of my face, let me tell you that at the very instant when the soul turns traitor, its body is possessed by a demon that stays in charge of it until its allotted time is over. But the soul falls straight down to this abyss. Take this shade who winters here behind me. Maybe his body is still on earth as well. If you've just come, you'll know. Is Brancadoria still up there? For it's many a long year since he was shut here in this fellowship. You must be lying to me, I said to him. Brancadoria's still alive. He eats and drinks and sleeps and puts his clothes on him. It's not true. Michael Zanke has not yet arrived in that upper ditch, the Malebranche, where the vortex of the clinging pitch is boiling. When this Branca left a devil in his body in the world above, the same with one of his cousins who collaborated in his treachery. But come on, reach out your hand to me, open my eyes. But I didn't open them for him, and being boorish towards the likes of him was courtesy. People of Genoa, strangers to every decency and disfigured by every vice conceivable, why are you not wiped clean off the face of the earth? For down with the very worst soul from Romagna, I came on one of yours who, because of his deeds, already bathes in Cocytus in spirit, while up in the world he seems bodily alive.
Thank you, Kenneth, and thank you, Mary, and thank you, Jason, and Elsina, and Dario, and Valentina for those wonderful, wonderful readings. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. We are almost there, folks. We have now arrived at the final part of our evening, and this time we're going to remove ourselves from the darkness of the Inferno and to see once more the stars, Arriva delle Stelle, as Dante has it. But this time we're going to do it through the Irish language. As Emma explained earlier to us, both O'Flynn and De Bruyne had particular ways of translating Dante. Less famous than De Bruyne's translation, we thought we would do Christopher O'Flynn, who's now in his 90s, the honor of reading out his Canto 1 of the Purgatorio. We won't be reading the Italian on this occasion, just the Irish, but the Italian and the English will be there. And Emma has very kindly agreed to read it for us. Emma.
Thank you. Purgador, Dawn a hen. Is fear na fargi atá sína rih chuir chin mérimeg ordú seol, treis dom coola huirtavir ho fiachvar. An dar riocht is ávernis dom cheol, mar an ngaun an tanam déanad trí for góid a ágan fiúntaché de nav na nord. Is an seo a bhéthe banathe is cór os mé bhór mail an éig se seirí. An seo bíoch Calliope muna gnó a tiúnlachan micheol se leis an lí, a dag na Pieri des trá cho hanis, nor beléir gan Jofi éireach in na muis. Chuir micheod an irthir yall a tanamh, réim se sév na crinne os michiún. Mín da ó bhór go bon na spéire lethe. Da bhúscail an lúchair rart na súl, hachtam slán on blúcha mar vante dag mochte norcas idir chliamh is húl. An plan é a díl a bheir so lás an rále, le a gealráire hir fud na spéire, is dolig na héisce hiúnlaí mar háda. Chas me se deisiil is dhírig mar de féchant, Mele an daun, is chnoc ceire réalthe, nach vacas a gháine dús an réise. Behoig hostan spéir le gille lese, o a lasver hoigen a makter rart na roundse is gaule baintrachu voor de vele. Treis me raik of winti of sun baulbug, has me asje le molellen down. Sit zo in kellichen kechte oom gefaanlag. Is genoeg gemakke shanna in a ener aan. Ho herik shin in a glo gur hil a moos, irides a hilach aher on a clown. An eesog adde brak le gille gloor. A alt an dol kene a son sille gá hole noos a 8 benete koor. Vi linner na gerane reelt oud bejille a masúch noose le gahne hog lenach nar leir ies an rien a bheit nach inne. Keisifse an garker hiri ho met tiernaf, ag elu in eigen sochar geslaan, sé, is och liche irke leirse. Keir rorig sif. Cohorse van Trilshan, de tachte níos de vegan na hihe in nóglaun iferinatá den dirichach lán, wil rébe mar sin diantar na zelihe, no an malert corle tá glach nav, godag an sibse tá damantam hirse. Leis sin, ro graim orm marshori cart, slip brecher lava smeid doch her sinúl, na glúna lúbe is crumme cín le mas. Ansin, hog fragra. Niu am féin machluis. Ach ban ó nav an nuas a dimpig orm an dinne seo hiúnlachan féin stúr. ach mas tá leatsa míú haar mar a thugam, le fírin gáis le dhéanamh becht, ní féidir an thuilse leart le dahil. Níach an farse fós a chríocha techt ach rug a dhealtachas an trosan é cho géir, nar an puin am an chuntas rivimecht. Agus fé mar dúirt mé curach ormsa féin cuara me lánithe, sníor léir do mallart slíach an bailach seo tá gafa gom go tréan. Has bánas dó an draumas meas a bhí, inis is mian go bheiceach fé de smacht na spridach lantart sin a bhír a hraí. Mar rugus eisianlum de bad éon seacht, ach hangamar dod bhreathnús dod chlisint, de cochtón ár nuas a dáir dacht. Fáil sé grifa, ó dairig ling tú chrisint, sír se tahhuig, an ní a hill an grá, mars óld an taobhásig trína hiiscint. Is dit je zól, níor dúltaigh tú don bhás in útecha, mar arágas se le taobh an chlutha dhealaigh ummat hacht an lá, níl dlí sirí dá héan éon taobh, is beoldó son, níl smachtaigh mínas ormsa, den thiorcail mé, mar a bhfuil ris gan chléin do bhná féin martia go fólaigh impi artsa, a chrí gan cháin gur leatsa í de hir. Si bhéad a grá mar sin glachlinn gan dahal. Lig doin tastal séir trí de hacht riocht, is tuairhead féin a déin go buich de scéala, más fiú leat fós de luas an áit sin híos. I martí is mé beoch lacking haréan rud tanmh na súl sé. Gach míon dá tail. Níor gád sé ach a íri orm a dhéanamh. Ach a níos ó sí hawl ar haing an ilk, ní hiig mé léamh aga. Tréir an tlí sin a richoch nuair a hang a sérón ris. Mas ban ó nef a bhóg do chríos a rialig de chéim dar leat ní gápla más a chleachta leorlam gníor fád síhí, pérod is míonlih. Imig mar sin, is ceangal hart ar an bharsa gulachach bhín, an sin ní hiig túach núis. Go méid gachríon den drí beníos de galanta. Níor bhadal suas go siúl fé chiún ná smút a teachta láthar an chéad ghóir de daomh. Éon de locht angelí farthe sé siúd. Hart ar an iláinéin seo taobh go taobh mar a móil an tunta trom ar an trá fásan an dhealachach ar an buiteach muí. Níl plan ar bid an míon le dilí lán nó a chrúan a dhéatach marach dáil an siúd, or ní lúpadís nuair a bhuailach an sé down. Dá éis ní gádaí filan se suas, an rian atá ag airí déanthaigh léirthe spáint a bhail idir féitir an sliamh a cháil gan dua. Dimig an sin. Is dairig me semáit gan labhart, gur chuidas mar a raibh me seoirí. Séirich núis chníos mar rair gom lán. Ar sesin, lean me chéim na gcónaí, cas mí siar ortá an machar mínse dul le fána síos go himmel bóchna. Chur fáin an léir an go breacht den níche ar tethe glán, gur léir a bhadúin síos, crahán na marad múra go sílseach, a chuid mar thar an machar lam gan cí, ar nós an taobheocht dul tamúin a rian. Gach céim in eisce go bóchar ceart ríist. Nuair thuise mar raibh an drúchtas an rian in Amorvá, gur beag a chrumigas, trí chos an scáthas lohin ar spalpadían. Da chraum a bháistir síos go thuirsta le, go máin le mín a gá láimh ar an bhéir. Is mise ag raibh fis arún go maith, hógus na chroma lecin a féiríon na néir. Is thug sesin chun solis a thuair me dhealra fír. A celach fé smót go trauman if ar an géir. Íar sin de chluise mar chun na lamrá síos, nach bhac a riamh a seola ó himach, an duine meach an ná dó fila dír. San áit sin, chrslig sé mé, mar a bhíon ag neach, ó an túntas, níor luath an plán de ríisiil, stite, nó bhí a bhacasáil go bua cach, gan bhuiil san áit nar buinech é go díreach.
So now we're at the very end, and what better way, I suppose, than to end with De Bruyn. There he is in front of you, in a picture. He's in the front row, second on the left, with Eamon de Valera in the middle. And as we know, Eamon told us earlier on, his translation of Inferno dates back to 1963. And it wasn't then until 1997 that the entire Commedia was published. So to finish off this evening, Emma has again very kindly agreed to read the second half of Paradiso 33, the very final canto of Dante's Commedia, in De Bruyn's translation. And then we'll pass over to Professor Corinna Salvadori Lonergan, who will bring this evening's proceedings, indeed bring our year of Dante celebrations to a close by reading the same passage in Dante's original. Emma.
I'm starting there at line 67, a Holish Vara. Where I suppose the point at which he begins to take in the face of the divine. A Holish Vara lemos cium na smuinte déna le go de magana rí sherriasacht, began den dellar of umtoch, nor haib shish Is kochtig me hanga onas godorhig iracht, is geveatig leid spray of ein dat de gloire gagent in a dieg, dan chinne tolle tiecht fos. Or machine rish mas lachum poje, is foe menu began se darnsche versi, bood de rug, is farade de varode. Credum se hiún lang is de jeracht an vioge oud, gedukach skahuli. Dar an gochtum der haste sheer de meechent. Skyneen gur vishnule me da hiúnsen, chun brickle solis an tsein gur voelis an fiaus nach tuurhole reen na soesje. Cadé mar eile rás gur leos an oinshin, darkas a door histach sa tolis giri, is go rekkes gacha revim rarke bochent. Chnock na reinach darshin go gwynien sé ein all laur vain, san grada gangelaun, a wil sa chrinne in me loge skuilte gach substaint gach akid gach ines atterhe, mar a vioch ni chele gorher no se jinnes. Ein tolis shimpli a vain den need dat dagarum. An tanaim sin ille firm Elina snaime, credum gavaki or fad time or rasha, braham a dolle maid an tahas on him. Is mo a heig daru das ein fointe vain dom nas, kui kied blianta fihe der an shola oud, le huna nor vran Neptune Scott argo. Ahu dom viaur chuige aulig, dan na colni, a darka gasaidor her reem perskubig, is le darka dolle dreshery of dog dotan. An taid de chihiga eachta ishin de hollis. A rian do schlies, na fulein valert rarke, a yetoch e dumpo oig le gele holle. Or an vachiene vien an tolle heimship, to gaffen son geleer, slas mo da aurk, neta aun na raubin aspefeimer. Is me vreire, is mo a veg fastescope son gara, chun 8-3 fiú a gwyneen na glór ha linnev le diol na kihe tá ní fós a hangen. Ní hégur raibh níos mó na daribh shingles sa tholas bioir a raibh ma huile fiachant is gomíon san aulig chuihes bhí sé rimis. Ach tuis gur ás a rin ma rairc tsénach de fiachant dom san ein saulú de haibh sig dós agus mise féinnig a harú chléchló. I gwile he róhaun, róheal substaint an tholis ard, chonachas dom trí fáini. Is bochafe shries in arshingacht gach reindóibh. Is mar vausin o vausin dom pálach, ceandiv o cheannas an siú cean na hinne o chean gechéile choríon dal nálach. Cad é mar aspa briar mo chlóras ligge góra gapam, is fós a góra vacas lúdi val son nágad dorhin mionar. A ein stolis hieri arbonnet féin a varer, dit féin a vain is ólachto, is machian tú san ólas gráchat héin. Is fátha tanmh. An malar tú atá ginte anat sa tlí sin, sa haibh sig dom mar tholas é gún pó anat. Tréis maurtha dom huile tamil timpel le nach féin de haulig dom bheith clóite. Leistig de féin le bracador gosúlacht nos go raibh me dhearc go léir leis tóca. Dáling hi méadrí a méchant le lán dúthracht ar hós ar thiorcail, sná féin le na smaoinmh an principal go bhfuil te riomh dá únas. Be boulig dósa leis an asling nuaise. Be bhíon le meiscint, chunas mar nímtar íomháil le ceorcail is cén chuí a bhain an buanacht. Ach náirt ní raibh im sciatháin féin den bhrísin. Mar ach gur bhfuil ar megan a bhuile farnart. Ben chuir bháin a thug a tulch an críche. Doling an ord saoíoch leis aspa cóchta. Ach be é a bhí ag umpó mian is tolle a réandom. Inis, mar ro, de bhí sa chas ar córíon, an grá a chorís, an Rian san ila réilhín.
Thank you, Emma.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay. Let's leave the last word to Dante. Corinna.
O somma luce, che tanto ti levi dai concetti mortali, alla mia mente ripresta un poco di quel che parevi, e fa la lingua mia tanto possente che una favilla sol della tua gloria possa lasciare alla futura gente. Che per tornare alquanto a mia memoria e per sonare un poco in questi versi più si concepirà di tua vittoria. Io credo per l'acume ch'io soffersi del vivo raggio, ch'io sarei smarrito se gli occhi miei da lui fossero aversi. E mi ricorda ch'io fui più ardito per questo a sostener tanto chi giunsi l'aspetto mio col valore infinito. O abbondante grazia, ond'io presunsi ficcarlo viso per la luce eterna, tanto che la veduta vi consunsi. Nel suo profondo vidi che s'interna, legato con amore in un volume, ciò che per l'universo si squaderna, sostanze, accidenti e lor costume quasi conflati insieme, per tal modo che ciò che io dico è un semplice lume. La forma universal di questo nodo credo che io vidi, perché più di largo dicendo questo mi sento ch'io godo. Un punto solo m'è maggior letargo che 25 secoli all'impresa che fe Nettuno a mirar l'ombra d'argo. Così la mente mia, tutta sospesa, mirava fissa, immobile e attenta, e sempre di mirar faceasi accesa. A quella luce cotal si diventa, che volgersi da lei per altro aspetto è impossibile che mai si consenta. Però che il ben, che è del volere obietto, tutto s'accoglie in lei, e fuor di quella è defettivo ciò che è lì perfetto. Omai sarà più corta mia fadella, pur a quel ch'io ricordo, che d'un fante che bagna ancor la lingua alla mammella, non perché più che un semplice sembiante fosse nel vivo lume ch'io mirava, che tale sempre qual s'era davante, ma per la vista che s'avvalorava in me guardando una sola parvenza mutando mio, a me si travagliava. Nella profonda e chiara sussistenza dell'alto lume parvemi 3 giri di 3 colori e d'una contenenza, e l'un dall'altro come iri da iri parea riflesso, e il terzo parea fuoco che quinci e quindi ugualmente si spiri. Oh, quanto è corto il dire e come fioco al mio concetto, e questo a quel che io vidi è tanto che non basta a dicer poco. O luce eterna che sola intessidi, sola t'intendi, e da te intelletta e intendente te ami e arridi. Quella circolazione che si concetta pareva in te come lume riflesso dagli occhi miei alquanto circonspetta dentro da sé del suo colore stesso mi parve pinta della nostra effigie, perché il mio viso in lei tutto era messo. Qual è il geometra che tutto s'affige per misurarlo cerchio e non ritrova pensando quel principio ond'egli indige Tal era io a quella vista nuova. Veder voleva come si convenne l'imago al cerchio e come vi si indova, ma non eran da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne. All'alta fantasia qui mancò possa, ma già volgeva il mio disio e il velle, sì come rota ch'igualmente è mossa l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle.
Bene, grazie Corinna.
Grazie.
Everybody. That was a wonderful way to end this evening. Thanks for those of you who stuck with us to the very end. I know it was a bit of a long evening, but it was always going to be thus. A special thank you to Emma and to Kenneth for speaking so eloquently and reading so eloquently for us this evening. To all our readers this evening, to Elliot, to bringing us into this wonderful world of his composition, to everybody who tuned in, especially to my colleagues in the Centre for Dante Studies here who read this evening, but for, as I said earlier on, for all their work throughout the year, and especially Corinna for this bit at the end.
No, Daragh, you've been the one to create the centre, and you've given us a year with your colleagues and with UCC's help. That's really an unforgettable one for Dante's 700 years. Thank you, Daragh. I really thank you deeply for that. And thank you for bringing in the Gaelic element. It's brought back to me my love of Gaelic poetry. And I really loved the sound of it. It was just beautiful. Thank you. I loved everything. I was so moved by Emma. I didn't think I'd be able to get through my little bit. But thank you, Daragh, because you've really done something quite unique. I think it's been a wonderful year. We have a Dante Centre, all of our own in Ireland, and you, your colleagues, your university are behind it. And that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's a very, thank you, Corinna. That's a nice point to maybe stop the recording